Most people who find Gnosticism think they've found an escape. They've walked away from the church, from the mosque, from whatever institution handed them a cosmology they couldn't quite believe anymore. They've found the word archon. They've found the demiurge. They've read enough to know that the God of the Old Testament might not be the highest reality, and that knowledge feels like freedom. But here's what most of those people haven't been told. Finding the map is not the same as leaving the territory. Because inside Gnostic cosmology, buried underneath centuries of suppression, book burning, and deliberate distortion, there is a teaching about reincarnation that changes everything. Not reincarnation the way the New Age movement sells it, not past lives as a curiosity. We're talking about a systematic mechanism, a trap, one that operates whether you believe in it or not. One that the Gnostic texts describe in precise, almost clinical detail. And the reason most people, even people who call themselves Gnostic, don't know the full picture is exactly what you'd expect. The full picture is threatening. The partial picture is manageable. This is the full picture. We're going to go through where this teaching comes from, what the texts actually say, how the trap is supposed to work, what the archons have to do with it, and most importantly, what the Gnostics said you could do about it. All of it, start to finish, nothing held back. I'm Daniel, and this is Gnostic Talk. Let's start with the architecture, because you can't understand the reincarnation trap without understanding what the Gnostics believed the universe actually is, and more specifically, who built it and why. Most people get handed a simplified version of Gnostic cosmology. The short version goes something like this. There's a true, ultimate God, the monad, pure light, utterly transcendent. And then there's a lesser being, the demiurge, who created the material world. The demiurge isn't quite evil, but he's confused. He thinks he's the highest God. He doesn't know there's anything above him. And we, as divine sparks of the true light, are trapped in the material world he built. That's the sketch. But the sketch leaves out the part that makes everything else make sense. In texts like the Apocryphon of John, one of the most detailed cosmological documents found at Nag Hammadi in 1945, the demiurge doesn't act alone. He has a hierarchy of subordinate beings beneath him, the archons. And the archons don't just govern the material world, they govern what happens between lives. Stay with me here, because this is where the cosmology stops being mythology and starts being a map. The Apocryphon of John describes the archons as rulers of what it calls the haimarmene, a Greek term meaning fate, or the system of compulsion that governs embodied souls. The haimarmene isn't just about what happens to you in this life. It's the mechanism that pulls the soul back into embodied existence after death. It's the machinery of return. I want to be precise about something. When I first spent serious time with the Apocryphon of John, and I mean really sitting with it, not skimming a summary, what struck me wasn't the drama of the cosmological narrative. It was the specificity. This text doesn't describe reincarnation as a vague spiritual concept. It describes it as a system, rulers with specific jurisdictions, a process with identifiable stages. It reads less like mythology and more like a technical manual that someone very much did not want you to read. And that specificity matters, because the Gnostics weren't making a philosophical observation about the nature of existence. They were diagnosing a problem. And a diagnosis that specific implies a cure that specific. Now here's where it gets cosmologically significant. The demiurge, in many Gnostic texts called Yaldabaoth, a name that some scholars translate roughly as child of chaos or begetter of the heavens, creates human beings with a specific limitation built in. The body, according to these texts, is not a neutral vessel, it's a binding. The Apocryphon of John describes Yaldabaoth and his archons constructing the human form layer by layer, each archon contributing something that further tethers the divine spark to the material realm. The soul that enters that form is a fragment of genuine divine light, but it enters into a structure designed to make it forget what it is. Forgetfulness. That's the mechanism, not punishment, not sin in the conventional sense. Forgetfulness is the operative word in texts across the Nag Hammadi library. The soul forgets its origin. It forgets the pleroma, the divine fullness from which it came. And a soul that has forgotten its origin does exactly what the archonic system needs it to do. It comes back. Not because it's punished, not because it has karma to resolve in the Eastern sense, but because it doesn't remember there's anywhere else to go. The Pistis Sophia, a text that runs to several hundred pages and is one of the most extended treatments of post-death cosmology in all of Gnostic literature, goes into remarkable detail about what happens after the physical body dies. The soul rises through what the text calls the sphere, a layered cosmic structure governed by archonic forces. And at each layer, those forces assess whether the soul carries the marks of gnosis, the knowledge and recognition that would allow it to pass through. If it doesn't carry those marks, it doesn't pass through. It returns. The soul is, in the language of the text, sent back down into the world according to the judgment of the archons. That's not metaphor, that's a mechanism. And the question the Gnostics were answering, the urgent, practical question underneath all of the cosmological layering was, how do you carry the marks that let you through? Here's what makes the reincarnation trap different from any other spiritual problem you've probably encountered. Most spiritual problems are problems of behavior. You did something wrong, you need to correct it. You have a bad habit, you need to discipline it. You're attached to something, you need to release it. The solution is effort in a recognized direction. The reincarnation trap, as the Gnostics understood it, is a problem of identity. And that's a fundamentally different category of problem. The trap doesn't catch you because you're bad. It catches you because you don't know what you are. In the Gospel of Philip, another Nag Hammadi text, likely composed somewhere in the 2nd or 3rd century, there's a line that I've returned to more times than I can count. Before we continue, there's something I want to place in your hands. We've gathered the forgotten texts, the ones the Church sealed away for 17 centuries, into a single guide for those who feel the pull towards something deeper. Because whether we speak of the archons, the demiurge, or the divine spark, one truth remains. This knowledge was never meant to be lost. This is for anyone who senses there's more to this reality than we've been told, and who's ready to remember it. You'll find it in the link in the description below, or you can scan the QR code right here. I'll give you a moment to do that. It says, in essence, that those who go out of the world without receiving gnosis have not received it, and cannot receive it. The implication is stark. The moment of death is not a reset, it's a test. And the test can only be passed with something you had to acquire before you got there. That changes everything about how you think about spiritual practice. It means that whatever you're doing, whatever ritual, whatever prayer, whatever moral practice, the question the Gnostic tradition is asking underneath all of it is, does this produce gnosis? Does this produce genuine interior recognition of what you are? Or does it produce something else? Comfort, community, moral improvement, emotional regulation, all real things, all potentially valuable, but none of them the specific thing that, according to this cosmology, actually matters at the hinge point. One viewer left a comment on my video about the archons, and this one stopped me mid-scroll. They wrote, "I've been doing all the right things spiritually for 15 years, and I still feel like I'm behind a pane of glass, watching my own life." That's not a description of spiritual failure. That's a description of what happens when the practice is aimed at the wrong target. Because here's what the archonic system is at its operational level. It's not a conspiracy of malevolent aliens plotting in some cosmic boardroom. The texts are more unsettling than that. The archons, in the Gnostic framework, operate through the structures that already exist, the structures of the material world itself. the systems of distraction, the architecture of need and desire and fear, the entire machinery of a life lived at the surface. The Apocryphon of John describes the archons as binding the soul through what it calls the counterfeit spirit, a kind of false self that the archonic powers attach to the divine spark at the moment of embodiment. This counterfeit spirit isn't evil in any dramatic sense. It's just convincing. It feels like you. It generates thoughts that feel like your thoughts, desires that feel like your desires, fears that feel genuinely urgent. And as long as the soul identifies with the counterfeit spirit rather than with the divine spark at its core, it remains inside the system. I spent a week with a single section of the Apocryphon of John once, the passage describing the construction of the counterfeit spirit, reading multiple translations, comparing the scholarly commentary, sitting with what it was actually claiming. And what I kept landing on was this. The text is not describing a metaphysical horror story. It's describing something recognizable. The counterfeit spirit is what most people call their personality, their preferences, their ego structure, the whole elaborate construction of selfhood that feels so obviously real and so obviously you. The Gnostic position isn't that this is evil, it's that it's confused with the real thing. And that confusion, that mistaken identification, is exactly what the system needs to perpetuate itself. Now, here's where the institutional stakes come into focus. I personally think this is the most deliberately obscured part of the entire Gnostic tradition, the part that the heresiologists, the early Orthodox Church Fathers, who wrote extensively against Gnostic movements, spent the most energy distorting. Irenaeus of Lyon, writing his massive anti-heretical treatise around 180 CE, didn't just argue that Gnostic cosmology was wrong. He characterized it as spiritually dangerous, as leading its adherents away from the saving community of the Church. But look at the structural logic of that objection. If the reincarnation trap requires interior gnosis to escape, gnosis that is individual, unmediated, and non-transferable, then there is no institutional role in the escape. You cannot be saved by the right affiliation. You cannot be saved by the correct sacrament administered by the correct priest in the correct sequence. The entire apparatus of institutional mediation becomes, in the Gnostic framework, not just unnecessary, but potentially an obstacle. Another layer of distraction. Another surface to live on instead of going through. Can't exactly put a collection plate in front of someone's internal awakening. Just saying. That's my one editorial interjection. I'll move on. Let's get specific about the mechanism, because the Gnostic texts are specific, and the specificity is the point. The Pistis Sophia, likely compiled somewhere between the 3rd and 4th centuries, spends enormous amounts of its narrative dealing with the geography of the afterlife, not as idle cosmological speculation, but as a survival manual. The text is structured as a dialogue between Jesus and his disciples after the resurrection, and a significant portion of it is dedicated to describing the process by which souls are recycled through the material realm. Here's the picture it paints. When a soul that lacks gnosis departs from the body, it enters the custody of what the Pistis Sophia calls the receivers of the outer darkness. These are archonic forces that assess the soul's energetic signature, what knowledge it carries, what recognitions it has achieved. If the soul carries genuine gnosis, the receivers have no authority over it. If it doesn't, the process of return begins. The text then describes something particularly striking. The soul is not immediately plunged back into a new body. It passes through what the Pistis Sophia calls the crossing, a period in which it can be influenced. During this period, if people who carry gnosis perform certain acts on behalf of the departing soul, those acts can alter what happens to it. The text is explicit that mysteries, specific Gnostic ritual practices involving light and recognition, can intervene in the recycling process. This is where the Gnostic tradition diverges sharply from conventional understandings of reincarnation. In most popular framings of reincarnation, And in the versions that filtered into New Age spirituality, reincarnation is neutral or even positive. The soul returns to learn, to grow, to resolve unfinished business. There's a trajectory to it, a curriculum. In the Gnostic texts, there is no curriculum. There is no growth through return. The return itself is the problem. The goal is not to reincarnate better. The goal is to not reincarnate at all. The Pistis Sophia is explicit about the hierarchy of outcomes. The best outcome is to receive the mysteries of the light and ascend directly to the pleroma without return. The next is to be reborn quickly into a body that is conducive to finding gnosis again, what the text calls a body in the right place, in a family or community where the teaching can be received. The worst outcome is to be born into repeated cycles of difficult embodiment, progressively more disconnected from the possibility of gnosis, until the soul is eventually what the text calls cast into the outer darkness, a form of dissolution rather than perpetual torment, but dissolution nonetheless. That's a cosmology with consequences, real ones. Now, I want to acknowledge something here because this is the point where people often object. They say, isn't this just a fear-based teaching? Isn't this just another version of hell and damnation dressed up in esoteric language? And I understand the objection. I had it myself the first time I really engaged with the Pistis Sophia's afterlife material. It felt coercive. It felt like the kind of teaching that keeps people in line through fear of consequences. But here's what shifted for me, and what I think is the crucial distinction. The teaching isn't saying, obey these rules or face punishment. It's saying, understand what you are, and the mechanism loses its power over you. The escape from the trap is not compliance, it's recognition. That's fundamentally different from any fear-based religious system I've ever encountered, because fear-based systems need you to remain in a posture of subordination. They need you to need the institution. Gnosis, by definition, eliminates the need for the institution. You can't institutionalize a knowing that happens inside a single human being. The trimorphic protanoia, a stunning text also from Nag Hammadi, written in the first person as the voice of the divine feminine descending into the world, expresses this in a way that hits differently than the more cosmological texts. The protanoia, which means first thought, speaks of descending into the world specifically to awaken the souls that are lost inside it. And the language she uses isn't the language of rescue from outside, it's the language of recognition from inside. She says, I am the movement that dwells in them all. I am the invisible one within them all. That's not a savior coming from above. That's the divine identifying itself as what was already present inside the trap. The escape isn't arrival, it's remembering. As I covered in my video on the Archons, the full story of the Archons, every Gnostic must know this. The Archonic system doesn't operate on souls that know what they are. The jurisdictional authority the Archons hold is specifically over those who remain unrecognized to themselves. The moment of genuine self-recognition, genuine gnosis, is, in the cosmological framework, a moment that falls outside the system's reach. Which means the question isn't, how do I escape the trap after death? The question is, how do I arrive at the moment of death already outside it? So let's get into the actual mechanics, because this is where most introductions to Gnostic cosmology stop short. They'll tell you the Archons exist. They'll tell you the Demiurge constructed this realm. They'll gesture at the idea of a trap and then leave you with nothing but cosmic anxiety and no map. That's not what this is. We're going in deeper. In the Gnostic understanding, the material world isn't just a place of spiritual struggle. It's a closed system with a specific function. That function is the recycling of consciousness. When a human being dies without gnosis, without genuine interior recognition of their divine nature, the Gnostic texts suggest that the pneuma, the divine spark, doesn't simply ascend. It gets caught. It passes through the planetary spheres, each one governed by an archon, each one functioning as a checkpoint. And at each checkpoint, the soul that doesn't know itself is processed back through. The Pistis Sophia is the most detailed Gnostic text on this. It's lengthy, dense, and takes serious effort to sit with. I personally spent weeks working through sections of it, cross-referencing the different translations, and what kept surfacing was this consistent architecture, the afterlife as administered territory. Not a neutral corridor you pass through on the way to liberation, a managed system with gatekeepers and a default outcome. The default outcome is return, not return as punishment. That framing is important to resist. The Gnostic system isn't moralistic in the way that karma-based frameworks are. It's not that you return because you were bad or insufficient. You return because you were unrecognized. You return because the system processes what it can identify, and what it can identify is a soul that still believes itself to be what the system says it is, a material being, a subject of the demiurge, a creature defined by its earthly appetites and attachments. The archons don't need to forcibly drag you back. The unawakened soul reinserts itself. The gravitational pull of unrecognized identity is all the mechanism that's needed. This is the part that makes the reincarnation trap qualitatively different from Buddhist or Hindu understandings of rebirth. And I want to be precise about that distinction because conflating them misses something critical. In many Eastern frameworks, reincarnation is a ladder. You climb through lifetimes toward eventual liberation, accumulating merit, refining karma, approaching the divine asymptotically. The cycle is long, but it has a logic of progress built into it. The Gnostic framework removes that comfort entirely. There is no guarantee of progress through repetition. More lifetimes don't automatically bring you closer to Gnosis. In fact, the Gnostic texts suggest the opposite risk, that each return further embeds the soul in forgetfulness, that the numbing effect of material existence compounds across incarnations. You don't gradually remember by living more lives. You remember by waking up inside this one. The exegesis on the soul, one of the Nag Hammadi texts, describes the soul's condition in the material world as a state of prostitution, not as a moral judgment, but as a structural description. The soul that doesn't know itself gives itself away to whatever the world demands of it. That process doesn't self-correct over time, it deepens. Now here's where it gets cosmically significant. The archonic spheres that function as checkpoints after death aren't arbitrary bureaucracy. They map onto specific psychological and material attachments. Different Gnostic schools identified them differently. Some aligned them with the 7 classical planets, others with specific emotional patterns, but the underlying logic is consistent. What you were bound to in life is what binds you in death. The archon that processes you isn't looking for sin, it's looking for resonance. If your identity in life was constructed around fear, around possession, around the desperate need for external validation, those frequencies match frequencies in the archonic system. That's the hook. That's the tether. And this is why the Gnostic path is fundamentally one of interior transformation rather than external performance. It's not about dying with the right words on your lips or having attended the right rituals. It's about having shifted what you are resonant with. A soul that has genuinely recognized its divine origin doesn't resonate with archonic frequencies. The checkpoints are real, but they only process what they can process. Genuine gnosis in this framework isn't just spiritually significant, it's cosmologically disruptive. It's a soul that the system doesn't know what to do with. A soul that has, in some deep interior sense, already left. There is one element of the reincarnation trap that I want to spend real time on, because it's the piece that, when I first encountered it, rattled something loose in me in a way that very few ideas have: the light. Almost every near-death account across cultures includes it: the tunnel and the light at the end, the warmth, the sense of peace, the feeling of being welcomed home. It's the most universally reported feature of the near-death experience, and it's been treated, almost without exception, as evidence of divine welcome. the beautiful afterlife, the confirmation that something good waits on the other side. The Gnostic texts look at the same phenomenon and say something else entirely. In the Pistis Sophia and in several of the Nag Hammadi texts, the archons are described as light-wielding. They don't appear as darkness, they appear as luminosity. The demiurge itself, in the Apocryphon of John, is described as having taken light, specifically the divine light that fell from the pleroma through Sophia's movement and incorporated it into the material construct. The world contains real divine light. It also contains archonic counterfeit light. And the Gnostic warning is, at the moment of death, these are not automatically distinguishable by an unawakened soul. The Gospel of Philip says it plainly, and I'm paraphrasing the structure of the idea rather than quoting precisely. The powers, meaning the archons, do not see those who are clothed in the perfect light. But by implication, those who are not so clothed are visible to the powers, findable, processable. What this creates is a cosmological interpretation of the near-death tunnel that is, to put it plainly, disturbing. The light at the end of the tunnel may not be the pleroma. It may be the first archonic sphere presenting itself as home. The warmth and welcome you feel may be precisely the mechanism, the lure back into the system. The sensation of peace may be the soul's relief at finding something familiar, something that resonates with what it knew in life, without recognizing that the resonance itself is the trap. I want to be precise here, because this idea is easy to sensationalize, and I'm not interested in that. The Gnostic texts don't claim that everyone who follows the light is lost. They claim that discernment at the moment of death requires the same interior recognition that gnosis develops in life. You don't suddenly become awake at death if you weren't awake before it. The conditions for navigating death wisely are the conditions cultivated in life. The Gnostic path, understood this way, is fundamentally a death preparation practice. Not morbid, practical. One viewer, after my video, "I revoked my pre-birth contract with the demiurge, then this happened," left a comment that I kept returning to. They wrote, "This makes me wonder if all the comfort we're promised, in religion, in near-death stories, everywhere, is specifically designed to keep us from asking harder questions." That's a sharp observation, and it lands directly on what the Gnostic texts are pointing at. The comfort that prevents interrogation is itself a mechanism. The answer that closes the inquiry is always worth examining more carefully than the answer that opens it. Now, the alternative the Gnostic tradition offers isn't bleak. I want to make that clear. It doesn't say, "The light is fake, trust nothing, die in existential paralysis." What it says is more precise and, I think, more useful. It says, "The soul that knows what it is cannot be deceived about where it is going." The pleroma, the fullness, the true divine realm, isn't recognizable through warmth and welcome alone. It's recognizable through gnosis, through the same interior knowing that is developed in life, and which, at the moment of death, functions as a kind of navigational compass. Not a pass that gets you through a gate, a fundamental orientation. A direction you've already been moving in, which continues. The trimorphic protonoia, which is one of the texts I find myself returning to consistently. I'm Daniel, and this is Gnostic Talk, and this text is one of the reasons I built this channel. Describes the divine as descending 3 times into the material world, each time in a different form, specifically to wake souls up from within the system. The point isn't that the divine is distant and hard to reach. The point is that the divine has been actively, persistently trying to get through. The trap is real, but it was never designed to be permanent. It was designed for souls that sleep. For souls that wake, it was always permeable. Here's what I've noticed across every conversation this channel generates, every comment thread, every message. People absorb the cosmology, the demiurge, the archons, the reincarnation trap, the counterfeit light, and then they arrive at the same wall. Okay, so what do I actually do? What does the exit look like from the inside? I personally think this is the most underrated part of the Gnostic tradition. Not the dramatic cosmological architecture, as important as that is, but the interior technology it developed for navigating it. The maps are extraordinary. But the Gnostics weren't just cartographers, they were practitioners. And what they practiced was Gnosis not as an intellectual category, but as a lived interior event. Let me be clear about what Gnosis is not. It's not agreement with a set of propositions. You can read every Nag Hammadi text, memorize the Pistis Sophia front to back, be able to recite the hierarchies of the Pleroma in their correct order, and have zero Gnosis. That's not an insult. That's an important structural distinction the texts themselves make. The Gospel of Philip draws a precise line between faith, which involves intellectual assent to content, and Gnosis, which involves direct experiential recognition of divine nature. The first can be performed, the second cannot. You can fake faith convincingly. You cannot fake Gnosis, because Gnosis isn't a claim you make to others. It's a recognition that occurs inside you with no external witness required. Knowledge. Direct, interior, unmediated. So what does it actually feel like? The Gnostic texts don't describe it in phenomenological terms, the way a meditation manual might, but they circle around it consistently with a specific cluster of imagery. Awakening from sleep. A light becoming visible that was always present but unnoticed. The sudden recognition of something familiar that was inexplicably forgotten. The Apocryphon of John frames the divine spark in the human being as something that was placed there before the material world was constructed, not inserted from outside, but native to you, covered over. Gnosis is not the acquisition of something new, it is the uncovering of something original. This distinction matters enormously for practice. If Gnosis were something you needed to acquire, then the path would be additive, more study, more ritual, more accumulation of spiritual capital until you crossed a threshold. But if Gnosis is a recognition of something already present, the path is subtractive. You're not building toward it, you're removing what obscures it. The exegesis on the soul describes the soul's return to the divine not as an ascent to somewhere it never was, but as a return to what it always was before the descent into matter. The movement is inward, not upward. I want to tell you about a specific moment I had with this. I was sitting with the Apocryphon of John, and I mean sitting with it the way you sit with something that unsettles you. Not reading for information, but reading to let it land. And I hit the passage where the divine voice says, in essence, I am the one who is with you always. I am the Father. I am the Mother. I am the Son. I am the one who exists forever. I'm working from memory of the structure, not a word-for-word quotation, but the movement of it is what arrested me. Because it's not presented as a cosmic being addressing humanity from a distance. It's presented as the divine recognizing itself inside the material world. The divine has entered the trap to wake up what it hid inside the trap. And the human being is the hiding place. Something shifted when I understood that. Not emotionally, structurally. The entire framework of seeking, which I had inherited from years of conventional spiritual practice before finding my way to Gnosticism, inverted. Seeking implies the thing you're looking for is elsewhere. Gnosis implies it was never elsewhere. The seeking itself was the misdirection. Now here's the practical bridge. Because the Gnostics were not quietists who simply sat in contemplation waiting for recognition to arrive. They developed practices, the use of sacred language, specific meditative forms, communal rituals of recognition, all designed to strip away the archonically reinforced false self and expose what was underneath. The Gospel of Philip describes the bridal chamber rite, which wasn't a literal ceremony so much as a metaphor for the interior union of the pneumatic self with its divine source. The moment where the separated piece recognizes its origin, and in that recognition reunites with the pleroma, in principle, if not yet fully in fact. The key word is recognition, not achievement, not arrival. Recognition. You are not trying to become something. You are trying to see something that was already true. That's the move. That's what the exit looks like from the inside. It's not dramatic. It's not always accompanied by visions or experiences. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's the most ordinary feeling thing that has ever happened to you. A radio locking onto a frequency it was built to receive. Not a new signal. The signal it was always designed for, finally coming through without static. Now let's widen the lens, because you can't tell the full story of the reincarnation trap without asking the question that the history demands. Why was this suppressed with such ferocity? Why did it take until 1945 and a fortunate accident in the Egyptian desert? A farmer named Muhammad Ali al-Saman, stumbling across a sealed jar at the base of a cliff near Nag Hammadi, for the physical texts to return to human hands. Why were these ideas treated as not merely wrong, but dangerous enough to require systematic eradication? The answer isn't theological disagreement. Theological disagreement is handled with argument, with countertexts, with debate. What happened to the Gnostic communities was different in kind. Irenaeus, Bishop of Lyon, published his massive treatise Against Heresies around 180 CE, and the framing is telling. The energy isn't the energy of someone patiently correcting error. It's the energy of someone identifying a threat. The Gnostic communities were growing. Their ideas were spreading through the Roman world with a speed that alarmed the Proto-Orthodox Church, not just because they were theologically unorthodox, but because of what they structurally implied. Here's what I mean by that. The Gnostic path, as we've been tracing it through this video, is fundamentally self-authorizing. The locus of spiritual authority is interior, the pneuma, the divine spark, the capacity for direct recognition of divine nature. You don't need a priest to mediate that. You don't need a liturgical calendar to schedule it. You don't need an institution to certify it. A Gnostic community's function isn't to grant access to the divine, but to support the conditions under which each member can access it directly. The community is a context for individual awakening, not a hierarchy of dispensation. That's a structural threat to any institution whose power depends on being the necessary mediator between human beings and the divine. Can't exactly put a collection plate in front of someone's internal awakening, just saying. But it goes deeper than economics. The reincarnation trap doctrine is specifically threatening because it relocates ultimate spiritual stakes, where your soul ends up after death, from institutional adherence to interior recognition. If the orthodox framing is follow the church, receive the sacraments, confess to the priest, and your soul will be safe, then the Gnostic counterframing is the institution cannot protect you at death because the protection that matters at death is gnosis, which no institution can grant you and no institution can take away. That's not just competition. That's the complete dissolution of the institutional leverage point. Valentinus understood this better than almost anyone. Valentinus was arguably the most sophisticated Gnostic theologian of the 2nd century. Some scholars rank him among the most intellectually formidable religious thinkers of antiquity. He came within a single vote of becoming Bishop of Rome. One vote. Sit with that for a moment. If that election had gone differently, the Christianity that shaped Western civilization for 2,000 years might have been Valentinian, might have centered gnosis, an interior recognition, as the core of Christian practice, rather than creedal conformity and institutional mediation. One vote. History pivots on almost nothing sometimes. Instead, Valentinus was marginalized, his followers were targeted, and within a few generations, the textual tradition that preserved these ideas was being actively destroyed. Libraries were burned, communities were disbanded. The people who kept these texts were, in some cases, killed for it. That's not theological disagreement. That's an institution protecting a monopoly. And here's the thing about suppression as evidence. When an institution attacks a teaching, not because it's demonstrably false, but because it's structurally incompatible with its own authority, you're looking at a different kind of signal. Attacks on falseness use argument. Attacks on threat use force. The early church used force against Gnosticism. That tells you something about what they understood the Gnostic teaching to be doing. I spent several days specifically researching the trajectory of Gnostic suppression from Irenaeus through the Nicene consolidation in the 4th century, the period when the Roman imperial apparatus folded into the church and gave institutional Christianity a level of coercive power it hadn't previously had. What struck me most wasn't the scale of the destruction, though that's significant. What struck me was the consistency of the targeting. It wasn't random. The texts that were most aggressively targeted were precisely the ones that most directly undermined the need for institutional mediation, the ones that located divine authority inside the individual rather than delegating it to a hierarchy. The Apocryphon of John, the Gospel of Philip, the Pistis Sophia. These weren't suppressed because they were confused or poorly argued. They were suppressed because they were coherent and compelling and pointed in a direction the institution could not afford to follow. That coherence is what we're recovering here, not as nostalgia, not as rebellion for its own sake, but because the question, the reincarnation trap doctrine, forces you to answer, do you know what you actually are at depth before you die? Is the most consequential question the tradition ever asked. And it cannot be answered by any institution on your behalf. So here's where everything we've covered lands. The reincarnation trap, as the Gnostic tradition articulates it, is not a punishment. It's not a cosmic accident. It's not the result of bad luck in a morally neutral universe. It is a structural condition, one the tradition says can be recognized, named, and ultimately exited. But only by a specific kind of knowing. Not belief, not ritual compliance, not moral accumulation across lifetimes. Gnosis, direct, interior, unmediated recognition of what you are at the level that precedes incarnation itself. That distinction matters more than almost anything else in this entire conversation, because there are a lot of spiritual frameworks that will tell you the cycle of rebirth is real. Buddhism says it. Hinduism says it, various New Age systems say it, and many of them offer paths toward eventual liberation, karma cleared across lifetimes, merit accumulated, lessons finally learned. The Gnostic tradition does not disagree that the cycle exists. What it disagrees about, fundamentally, is the nature of what's doing the cycling, and who built the system the cycling happens inside. The archons didn't create a trap and leave it unlocked. According to texts like the Pistis Sophia and the Books of Jude, the processing of souls after death is not passive. It is administered. There are structures, weighing, reviewing, redirecting. And the Gnostic literature is remarkably specific about what determines whether a soul gets redirected back into matter or moves beyond the reach of those structures. It is not moral virtue alone. It is not devotion to the right deity alone. It is whether the soul carries the light of genuine self-knowledge, gnosis, that the archonic system simply cannot process because it belongs to a register of reality the demiurge and his architects never had access to in the first place. The demiurge, remember, is not omniscient in Gnostic cosmology. That's one of the most radical claims the tradition makes, and it's one I personally sat with for a long time before it settled. The creator of this world, the architect of the system we're embedded in, does not know what he doesn't know. He built a world out of lower materials and doesn't have full sight of the pleroma, the divine fullness that exists beyond his jurisdiction. The divine spark inside each human being came from that pleroma. The demiurge didn't put it there, which means he doesn't fully understand it, which means critically that a soul carrying awakened gnosis carries something the archonic processing system was never designed to contain. That's the exit. Not escape through cleverness, not escape through ritual formula, though some Gnostic traditions did develop specific passwords and declarations meant to be spoken at the thresholds after death. And there's something genuinely striking about that. The idea that what you know at the moment of dying matters in a structural and not merely psychological sense. But beneath the ritual layer, the Gnostic understanding is consistent. What passes through is what is real. What is real, in the deepest sense, is the pleroma-sourced spark. And the spark is only operative, only active, only capable of navigating beyond the lower structures when it has been recognized from the inside. I want to be precise about something here because this is where the teaching gets misread most often. Recognizing the spark does not mean intellectually agreeing that you have one. I cannot stress this enough. Reading this, watching videos about this, being able to explain Gnostic cosmology at a dinner party, none of that is gnosis. None of that activates anything in the structural sense the tradition is pointing to. The Gnostic texts are almost impatient about this distinction. The Gospel of Philip makes it plain. There is a difference between encountering a name and encountering the reality the name points toward. You can know the word light in complete darkness. Knowing the word doesn't illuminate the room. I spent a long time being fluent in this material before I understood that fluency was not the same as recognition. That was uncomfortable to admit. There's a particular kind of spiritual vanity that lives in having the right vocabulary, in being able to map the cosmology, in feeling like you're among the ones who see through the system. And the tradition itself warns against it. The Gnostic texts are full of figures who mistake knowledge about for knowledge of, and the consequences in the cosmological framework are exactly the same as for someone who never encountered the teaching at all. You still don't know what you are. The trap still holds. The actual recognition the tradition points to is harder to describe and easier to dismiss. It happens in the interior. It is not a feeling exactly, though it often comes with a felt quality. It is more like, and I'll use the analogy that has stayed with me longest, it is more like the difference between reading a description of your own face and seeing your own face in a mirror for the first time. Both involve the same information. Only one of them is recognition. And that recognition, once it lands, changes what you are in a way that reading and studying and believing do not. Not because something was added, because something was remembered. That's the heart of the Gnostic case against the reincarnation trap. Not that the trap isn't real, not that the archons are a metaphor for bad vibes, but that the trap was built for a version of you that you are not at depth, and that what you actually are, recognized clearly, was never fully inside the trap to begin with. This is what I'm Daniel, and this is Gnostic Talk. This is the territory we keep returning to. Not because it's comfortable, because it's the question that doesn't go away. In my video on the full story of the archons, I mapped out the structure of the system itself. The hierarchy, the jurisdiction, the specific archonic functions the texts describe. If you haven't watched that one, it will give you the architectural context for everything we covered here. And in the video on the monad's hidden exit, the archons pray you never find, I went deep on the specific nature of the exit point, what the monad actually is at the level of your own consciousness, and why the archonic system has no response to it. But the thing I want to leave you with tonight is this. Every spiritual tradition worth taking seriously eventually arrives at the same brutal question. What are you, really, underneath everything the world has told you that you are? What is looking out through your eyes when you forget to perform yourself for a moment? What remains when you subtract the roles, the history, the accumulated identity? Most traditions answer that question with doctrine. Here is what you are. Read this text, accept this formulation, trust this institution to hold the answer on your behalf. The Gnostic tradition gives a different instruction. Don't accept the answer, find it. Look directly. The looking itself is the practice. And what you find, if you look without flinching, is the thing the trap was never built to hold. Stop cycling by default. Start recognizing by intention. You were never just a soul moving through a system built by a lesser god. You were the light that lesser god never had access to, wrapped temporarily in matter, waiting to remember itself. If this landed for you, if something in what we covered tonight names something you've already been circling, leave a comment below and tell me, what part of the reincarnation trap doctrine hit you hardest? I read every single one.